Utah, especially northern Utah and the Winter Basin, is one of the most active paranormal and supernatural hotspots on the planet. Everything from unidentified lights in the sky to weird humanoid figures, and even Bigfoot, has been spotted in the region. It has a long history of high strangeness accounts that date back to the earliest human settlements. 3 out of every 4 people in this part of the state have experienced something out of the ordinary. And for many others, just passing through, there is a palpable feeling that those dusty roads and bleak landscapes hide something of a dark secret. Nestled within the basin's strange occurrences, a 480-acre ranch stands as a mysterious epicenter, located 100 miles east of Salt Lake City. Though the usual naming traditions associated with the owner, this land has earned a specific reputation over time. I'm Joe, and today I'm gonna tell you about Skinwalker Ranch. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, this ranch was owned by a family that has long remained anonymous. For reasons unknown, they suddenly and inexplicably vacated the property in 1987, leaving it empty and unattended for more than 7 years. That was until 1994, when it was purchased by Terry and Gwen Sherman, along with their 2 children. The couple believed that they had found their dream home. The remote property was bordered to the north by a high ridge, which overlooked its sprawling green pastures, wild thickets of woodland, and its flowing creek. To the south, the entire estate exuded an almost tranquil beauty that was not lost on the Sherman family. Terry was a high-end cattle breeder, and he hoped that the ranch would provide the space, privacy, and security he needed to take what was not only his hobby, but his livelihood to the next level. He had bought the ranch for an extremely favorable price, far less than what it was worth. And when he signed the paperwork, he accepted the deeds with an excited, disbelieving look in his eyes. What he now held in the palm of his hand was his ambition, his prospects, his dream. He could not have known that the land he had just purchased would almost destroy him, not just financially, but also psychologically. When they had first viewed the property, Terry and Gwen had found the main homestead in a state of disrepair, which, of course, they had anticipated given the length of time it had stood empty. What they did not expect to find, however, was the sheer amount of deadbolts securing the home. Not just on the front and back doors, but on interior doors and all of the windows too. At the front and rear entrances, they also found heavy-duty chains attached to huge metal rungs embedded into the walls. It didn't take a genius to work out that these had been used to chain large, powerful guard dogs in place. Although slightly unsettled by these peculiarities, Terry and Gwen dismissed them, believing that the elderly couple who owned the ranch before them had been paranoid and overprotective. They had seemed rather eccentric, after all. In the real estate contract, they had inserted a number of unusual clauses. For instance, the Shermans were not permitted to dig on the land without prior approval from the previous owners. These irregularities were overlooked by the family, but somewhere in the back of Terry's mind, he could not help wondering what had spooked them to the point of installing this level of security. In time, of course, he would come to understand that this idyllic, stunning acreage was haunting in more ways than just its serene beauty. And in fact, the weirdness began almost straight away. On the first day of moving in, the Sherman family was unloading a truck in front of their new home when they spotted something on the far side of the pasture to the south. As it closed the distance, they could see that it was a wolf, loping gracefully towards them in a series of turns. This immediately set Terry on guard, but it wasn't just the presence of the wolf that concerned him. Scaling it against distant fence posts and bushes, he could see that this animal was at least 3 times the size of an average wolf. but its behavior was oddly disarming. It seemed nonchalant, friendly even, rather than aggressive, slowing down and then stopping about 50 yards away. It sniffed the air and gazed at the family with intelligent, piercing blue eyes before continuing on casually, padding towards them without a care in the world. It seemed entirely tame. It wagged its tail as it approached, and Terry's father, who had been helping unload the truck, bravely reached out to stroke the huge beast. Sherman Sr. stood over 6 feet tall, and even though he was a big man, its head easily came up to the top of his shoulder. It quickly became clear that despite the wolf's intimidating size and appearance, it meant no harm. The rest of the family relaxed and walked over to greet their strange visitor. Maybe it's somebody's pet, Terry ventured, glancing nervously at the coral about 70 feet to his left, and wondering if it had been wise to move some of his herd onto the ranch so soon. Inside the pen stood 4 of his breeding cows and as many calves. They were all clearly troubled by the wolf's presence, except for one curious youngster, which was sticking its head out between the metal bars, watching the scene unfold. Almost as soon as Terry had realized the danger, the wolf bounded across the short distance, and now had its huge jaws clamped around the cow's head. The young cow bleated and thrashed wildly as the wolf tried to drag it out of the pen. Terry grabbed an axe handle from the back of his truck and rushed over, beating the huge animal's flanks and kicking at its hind legs. But the wolf paid no attention and refused to let go. "Get my magnum," he shouted. His son ran across the truck, grabbed a .357 from the cabin, and handed it to his father. Terry quickly fired a shot at the wolf's abdomen, which rang out across the empty pasture, but it had no effect. The huge animal did not react in any way. It did not stagger or yelp. It did not even flinch. It simply continued to ravage the poor cow. In his desperation, Terry fired again, but the gun had no effect. After a third shot, however, the wolf slowly released its grip and backed off about 10 feet. The rancher could not believe his eyes. Very few animals could have survived 3 shots from a .357 Magnum at point-blank range. But this wolf was somehow not even wounded. There was no blood anywhere on its coat. Finally, he took a 4th shot, right at the animal's heart, and it retreated another 30 feet. There was something incredibly unnerving about the way it just stood there with an unconcerned look, contemplating whether to attack the calf for a second time. Terry sensed this and shouted at his son to get his .30-06 rifle from the house, which he did within a matter of seconds. The wolf remained perfectly still as he took aim with the heavier firearm, and he almost felt sorry for the poor beast. A deafening shot echoed across the wilderness as he pulled the trigger, and in that moment, he knew he'd hit his target. But instead of collapsing to the ground in a heap as it should have done, the wolf simply withdrew another 2 yards and stood looking at an increasingly unsettled Terry. He quickly took another shot, and this time he saw a chunk of flesh detached from the animal. But even this did not put it down. The wolf took a last unhurried look at the cow, then turned and trotted back in the direction it came from. Terry was dumbfounded. He knew he could not allow a large predator to remain on his land if he intended to breed cattle. So he called to his teenage son, and the 2 of them proceeded to go after it. They must have followed the wolf for about half an hour, catching glimpses of it as it ran to the south between patches of cottonwoods and other trees. The tracks led them through a copse of Russian olives, the other side of which was the creek, and emerging from the trees, they found themselves on a wide-open mud bank. They could clearly see the wolf's paw prints and immediately began to follow them. But the tracks abruptly stopped about 40 yards from the water's edge. Terry and his son could not believe their eyes. They were standing in a wide-open expanse of sodden mud, yet the paw prints ended right in the middle of the bank. The wolf would have had to leave an impossible 40 or 50 yards, in either direction to avoid leaving any more tracks. It had seemingly vanished into thin air. Returning to the homestead, Terry happened to pick up the piece of flesh that had detached from the animal. He noted that rather than being fresh and covered in blood, it looked and smelled rotten, as though it had been left out in the sun for a few days. In quiet contemplation, he turned his head south and looked out over the pasture towards the horizon, wondering what on earth had just happened. That was the first day. The next few weeks were relatively normal, except for a few strange occurrences around the homestead, all targeted towards Gwen. She didn't report any of these things to her husband at first, but she genuinely thought she was losing her mind. For instance, she would come home from shopping, unpack the groceries, and put them away. Then, she would leave the room to attend to something else. Moments later, she would return to the kitchen and find the groceries all back in the bags, as if she had never unpacked them. In other occurrences, she would go to have her customary morning shower, locking the door behind her. She would place her towel and hairbrush on the side. When she finished, she would step out of the shower only to find her towel and hairbrush missing. They would disappear, and a few hours later, she would find them in some random location elsewhere in the house. Things continued like this for some time, and Gwen was getting increasingly worried about her memory. That was until Terry came in one evening, demanding to know who had taken his post digger. He had been using it to repair a fence in the pasture and had turned away for a few moments. When he turned back, it was gone. Gwen explained that she and the children had been in the house all evening and proceeded to help him search for it. However, it was nowhere to be seen. A few weeks later, it was found hanging in a tree on the other side of the ranch, 70 feet off the ground, which was odd considering that this piece of equipment weighed over 70 pounds. By this time, the Shermans were beginning to suspect that something was not quite right about the property they had bought. About a week before they rediscovered the post digger, a nephew came to stay with them, and Terry decided to take the youngster on a tour of the ranch. His son also accompanied them, and it was well after sunset when they decided to return to the homestead. A few hundred yards ahead, Terry noticed a set of headlights moving along a distant fence line, well within the boundaries of his property. Had seen these lights before, and had assumed that someone had taken a wrong turn off the road to the east. But now, seeing them again, he suspected that these people, whoever they were hunting on his land without permission. He decided that he would confront them and immediately began marching in their direction. But as he picked up the pace, the lights began to move away from him. His brisk walk turned into a jog, and as the boys followed suit, he began to wonder why there was no engine sound. They had gotten to within 100 yards when the lights suddenly lifted off the ground and floated up over some distant treetops. Terry and the boys stopped dead in their tracks, shocked by what they were seeing. The lights silently continued on their course before disappearing out of sight. During the autumn, these lights became a frequent occurrence, especially as Terry began transporting his prized Symmetral and Angus cattle onto the ranch. The activity seemed to escalate with the arrival of his high-end livestock, and this is when things started to turn serious. As the winter months rolled in, severe snowstorms battered the region, and Terry found himself out at all hours rounding up cattle that had wandered too far astray. One late evening, he was out on horseback, searching for one of his prize Angus cows that had been missing for almost 24 hours. He had covered the whole ranch except for a dense area of woodland to the southwest, which he was now heading towards. As he approached the large outcropping of trees, he was relieved to see the unmistakable impressions of hoofprints in the deep snow, and he now knew that it was only a matter of time before he located the animal. He paused briefly as he considered the tracks. From the spacing, he determined that she had been running at full tilt as she had entered the tree line. This was odd behavior for a cow, especially during a snowstorm, unless she had been running from something. But what? Although it was unlikely for a predator to be hunting during this weather, it wasn't impossible. But he could see only one set of tracks. He followed the hoof prints for 20 yards into the trees and soon reached a wide clearing. The tracks continued out into the middle of the open space and then stopped dead. The cow was nowhere to be seen. A cold chill ran down his spine as he recalled how the wolf's tracks had stopped in a similar fashion, as if the animal had disappeared or had been sucked up into the air. He searched for a while longer but began to lose hope. In the end, he turned back towards the homestead with a heavy heart. The only thing Terry loved more than his cattle was his family. And to lose a single cow or bull was not only financially devastating, but also heartbreaking. He had a profound sense of pride in the breeding and rearing of each of his animals. Over the course of the winter, 4 more of his prized cows and bulls would disappear in a similar fashion. Terry began to spend many nights outdoors, sticking to the shadows and creeping around his property like a specter, trying to get the drop on whoever was taking his cattle. Unfortunately for him, whoever or whatever it was always seemed to be 2 steps ahead. The lights seen on his land were now commonplace, but he could only ever view them from a distance, never up close. No matter how silently he tried to creep towards them, they would simply move away as if they knew he was there. But then, in the early hours of one morning after yet another fruitless night, he was making his way back towards the homestead when a movement in the periphery of his vision suddenly caught his attention. To his shock, he saw a black mass hovering over the ground about 100 yards to his left, silhouetted against the pale white snow. Immediately, he hunkered down and quietly observed the strange object as it moved across the land. To his eyes, it looked like a slightly smaller, snub-nosed version of the F-117 Nighthawk. However, he knew that it couldn't have been an F-117 because this thing was completely quiet, floating about 20 feet off the ground, as if defying gravity. Colored light shone from its hull, flitting over the snow, as if it was searching for something. Terry was able to observe it for around 15 minutes as it made its way over to the west, before turning back and heading east again. Sitting still in the cold, Terry's arms were beginning to go numb, and as he stretched his limbs, his joints cracked. In the deathly silence, the sound seemed impossibly loud, but in reality, it was so insignificant that it wouldn't have been heard by anyone standing beyond the distance of 6 feet. Nevertheless, the lights on the strange craft suddenly went out. It then stopped and turned in his direction. For a few tense moments, Terry's heart thumped in his chest as the object seemed to glare at him. But to his relief, it turned and silently floated off to the north, out of sight. In the new year, as the spring rains began to lash the ranch, the family would lose even more cattle. But now, they began to reappear, sometimes dead from no apparent cause, other times extensively mutilated. The nature of these mutilations was bizarre. Huge chunks of flesh and skin were carved out of the animals, yet there was no blood. The wounds always seemed to be cut with precision instruments, displaying an almost surgical quality, rather than the savage tearing of predators. The Shermans were beginning to feel the stress caused by these losses. Throughout 1995, the strange activity only intensified. Events took place that were frankly beyond bizarre. The lights appeared over the ranch almost every night. More poltergeist activity was experienced in the homestead. Black, featureless entities began to appear, looking in through the windows, and later even entering the house and standing at the ends of beds. Strange sounds would emanate from the ground, almost as if there was machinery or railroads operating beneath their feet. Their neighbors would hear this too. They also heard disembodied voices speaking in strange languages coming from the sky. One morning, Terry woke to find huge cookie-cutter-like holes dug into his land, with no resulting piles of earth anywhere to be seen. Somehow, hundreds of pounds of soil had silently been removed from his property in the dead of night. In addition to this, strange creatures were spotted walking across the land. From humanoids that resembled Bigfoot to bizarre canine hyena hybrids with razor-sharp claws that would attack their livestock. There was an invisible entity that was often witnessed, not the being itself, but the effects of its presence. Livestock would part and move out of the way as if something big and unseen ran through the middle of the herd. Water in the canal would be displaced as if large invisible feet were stomping through it. Another smaller creature was witnessed that seemed to be shrouded in some sort of cloaking device, much like the alien entity from the movie Predator. Stationary orange lights were seen in the sky, which were different from the other ones Terry often witnessed moving in the distance. The first time he saw one of these anomalies, he was sitting out on his porch on a warm summer evening when something suddenly appeared in the sky about a mile away from his position. He had been cleaning his rifle earlier on in the day, and a high-powered scope just happened to be nearby. He grabbed it and proceeded to view the object through the telescopic sight. And what he saw left him sitting there, Murata Gapi. The orange object looked like some sort of portal, and at its center, he could see an opening. On the other side of that opening was a blue sky, even though the sun had long since set. In his mind, it looked like a gateway to another place. These anomalies became a frequent occurrence above the ranch, and Terry would later describe seeing odd-shaped craft entering and exiting these openings on several other occasions. The most disturbing of all phenomena, though, were the orbs. They were not as common as the lights or portals, but when they did appear, they were far more obvious, zipping in and out of nearby trees and harassing the livestock. These were mostly about the size of a tennis ball and had a blood-red color, but every so often, larger blue ones would show up, and these were bad news, nicknamed the Blue Meanies. These orbs were somehow able to instill intense fear in those who got too close to them. Perhaps it was a certain vibrational signal they gave off, which stimulated extreme anxiety. Terry and Gwen were never sure, but they feared the blue orbs more than anything else they had seen on the ranch. One evening, Terry was out on his porch again, observing the lights over his property as he often did, when he spotted an ominous blue glow coming from the tree line in front of his house. He was immediately on guard as one of the blue orbs emerged from the thicket and slowly made its way towards him. 3 of his best hunting dogs sat by his side, and the moment they saw the orb, they began to growl and bark. Without even thinking about it, Terry set them loose, and they proceeded to chase it back into the trees. Whatever fear it was able to stimulate in human beings did not seem to affect dogs, and Terry felt his spirits lift as he considered that a small battle had been won. But then suddenly, out of the darkness came 3 pained yelps, and then nothing. He waited for a couple of hours, but his dogs never returned. He was far too scared to venture out and look for them, but in the morning, he and his son went to search the copse of trees where he had last seen them. On the ground, they found 3-quarterized piles of flesh smoldering in the cool morning air. This was all that was left of his dogs. This proved to be the last straw for the Sherman family. They had endured much more than they could physically take over the last 2 years. They were not getting any sleep. The kids were doing poorly at school. Gwen had lost her job at a bank in town, and the whole family had taken to bunking in the same room because of the strange phenomena that were now regularly entering their household during the night. On top of this, they had lost 14 head of cattle, along with family pets, and they were now on the verge of bankruptcy. Seeing those vaporized dogs, it was now becoming clear just how much danger they were in. Terry had previously contacted a local newspaper about the strange activity taking place on his ranch, and although roundly ridiculed, the story was picked up by other publications. After being tormented to the point of mental breakdown, the Sherman family had nowhere to turn. They were stuck on a property that was haunted by something that went beyond their understanding. And to make matters worse, they were facing financial ruin. Fortunately, someone had heard their cry for help. In March 1996, around the same time that the Sherman family was considering leaving the ranch, billionaire real estate developer Robert Bigelow was busy putting together an organization that would come to be known as the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS for short. It was an ambitious undertaking, unprecedented in bringing together a well-funded, highly qualified, and state-of-the-art equipped team of scientists capable of deploying anywhere in the country at a moment's notice to investigate events of high strangeness. Never before had a scientific organization been formed with such significant funding for systematic analysis and scrutiny of paranormal and supernatural research. These specialized individuals were not fly-by-night dropouts. They were PhD professors qualified in subjects ranging from biochemistry and psychology to astrophysics and veterinary science. Bigelow recruited candidates with a skeptical frame of mind, field investigators who would always look for rational explanations first and foremost, leaving pseudoscience at the door. Additionally, he assembled a world-class advisory board whose members were handpicked from a wide array of disciplines. This group would evaluate evidence gathered by the field team's activities. NIDS comprised more than 25 members, mostly from the scientific community, but also including security personnel recruited from former military circles. Two of the most prominent members of the scientific team were physicist Eric Davis and biochemist Colonel Kelleher. Kelleher would go on to document both the Shermans and NID's experiences in his book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, which he wrote in collaboration with George Knapp. Shortly after NIDS was formed, they heard echoes in the press regarding a small ranch in the north of Utah that was apparently being visited by UFOs on a regular basis. Terry Sherman had reluctantly approached the local newspaper at the beginning of the year to report the strange happenings on his property as a cry for help. He suspected that the majority of the activity was somehow related to secretive military technology and hoped that bringing attention to the phenomenon might deter whoever was perpetuating. In the summer of 1996, Bigelow called a meeting to discuss the case. The ranch presented a tantalizing opportunity for NIDS, a laboratory out in the field away from prying eyes to study a wide variety of phenomena occurring on a regular basis. Within weeks, the NIDS team had met with the Sherman family, and after hearing their unbelievable experiences, expressed their interest in purchasing the property. While Gwen and the children were desperate to move, and would have been happy never to set foot on the ranch again, Terry, being a proud man, was not quite ready to leave. He was infuriated at being run off his own land, especially as he still didn't know what was behind the phenomenon. However, he had to do what was best for his family, and grudgingly agreed. He offered to become the ranch manager for the NIDS team to see how their investigation would progress and what answers they might find. By September of that year, NIDS had moved their observation trailer and mobile laboratory onto the property. The field team consisted of 4 scientists and a group of assistant investigators permanently stationed at the ranch around the clock. The field team's role was to collect and analyze evidence and then present it in monthly meetings to the advisory board. Upon arrival, the first thing the team did was run a battery of tests. The phenomena described by the Sherman family were far too varied and bizarre to pin down to any one explanation. Initial thoughts were that there was possibly a psychological or environmental angle to consider. Were the Shermans simply lying for attention? Had Terry and his family been suffering from a mass delusion? Were there plants on the land emitting spores with hallucinogenic properties? Was the family's water supply being contaminated? Did the ranch have areas with intense electromagnetic fields? Were there any instances of very low or ultra-low frequencies, otherwise known as infrasound? Were there any fault lines running across the property, creating a situation of mild tectonic or seismic stress? thought to cause light anomalies and visual hallucinations. The short answer to all of these questions was a resounding no, although it would take longer to answer some of these queries than others, especially regarding psychological factors. Despite this, aside from a few strange lights seen in the sky, the remainder of 1996 would be uneventful, and the NID's field team was initially doubtful of some of the more bizarre stories they had been told. But all that would change in the coming year, in essence, the longer the NID's team spent on the ranch, the more they would come to the terrifying realization that the Sherman family was telling the truth. On the 9th of March 1997, Terry and Gwen discovered the carcass of a black Angus cow lying on the grass a little over 100 yards from the homestead. Gwen seldom ventured onto the ranch since the family had moved away. But on this day, she had been helping Terry take some of the animals in the pasture. They had tagged this particular cow and then walked 300 yards across the field to tag others that were grazing to the south. While attending to this task, a dog that was with them began to growl. Its hair stood on end as it looked back toward the ranch house. Terry and Gwen followed its gaze and saw that the mother of the first cow was limping back and forth, clearly out of her wits. When they ran over to see what was going on, they found her calf on the ground. Its entire abdominal cavity, including all of its organs, had been removed. The only things that remained were its head, legs, and spinal column, with some of the rib cage still intact. It was also missing an ear, which looked as if it had been sliced off with an extremely sharp instrument. Most perplexing of all was that there was not one single drop of blood on the grass around the animal. The ear that had been sliced off was one that they had tagged less than 45 minutes before. During that time, something had removed more than 60 pounds of meat from this poor animal in broad daylight and in full view of the rancher and his wife. Though they hadn't seen or heard a thing, the NID's veterinarian was baffled. The cuts were clean and precise, with no spillage of blood. He surmised that no predator that he knew of could have been responsible. When asked whether they had noticed anything unusual prior to the incident, both Terry and Gwen reported that they had smelled a heavy musk odor in the area. After the vet had taken necropsy samples from the cow, the rest of the team began to search for tracks. In doing so, they happened to pass one of the kennels and saw that the dogs were all huddled inside. It should be mentioned at this point that NIDs had strategically placed 3 large observation towers on the property, each surrounded by a chain-link fence, inside which they housed a number of dogs. Canines had an uncanny ability to sense when something strange was about to happen, so the team used them as biosensors. Terry remarked how the dogs hadn't ventured out all day. In fact, they would refuse to leave their shelter for many days after this event. And slowly but surely, the NID's team would come to understand why something was lurking on the ranch. At around 11 p.m. on the 12th of March, the dogs started howling and barking at something on the far side of the pasture. Terry and the NID's team had been sitting inside the observation trailer at the time, but soon piled into a truck and headed towards the disturbance. The 4X4 had a bright spotlight fitted to the roof, and as they rounded the corner, the beam washed over copse of distant cottonwoods. In that moment, they saw a pair of yellow orbs sitting about 20 feet up in one of the trees, a huge pair of eyes reflecting the light. Terry stopped the truck, reached behind him for his rifle, and exited the vehicle. Leaning on the open door, he took aim. Through the scope, he could see the outline of a huge creature sitting in the tree. "I'm not gonna let it get another cow," he growled. It didn't move as he settled his sights. It just sat there, staring right back at him. The moment the rifle's report echoed across the open pasture, the eyes blinked out of existence, and a loud thud was heard as whatever it was fell from the branches. Terry got back into the vehicle and drove towards the cottonwoods, stopping about 40 feet away. There was no sign of the huge animal underneath the tree, or anywhere else. Everything was silent as Terry and the NID's investigators spread out and entered the tree line. They were about 5 yards apart when Terry shouted, "I see him." 2 more loud shots rang out as the NID's team ran towards him. They heard a commotion in the branches ahead as something heavy blundered through the thicket, moving away from them. It had disappeared by the time they reached the rancher. "It looked like a huge dog, but bipedal," he exclaimed. After searching for an hour in darkness, the team found only 2 large footprints spaced 20 feet apart, each 14 inches long, exhibiting huge claw indentations. The rest of the month passed by without further incident, but the dogs and livestock continued to act strangely, on edge with a haunted look about them, as if sensing a predator in the area. On the 1st of April, another calf vanished without a trace. No blood or tracks were found. It was there 1 minute and gone the next. On the 2nd, one of the weirdest and possibly most famous events on the ranch occurred, involving 4 of Terry's prized Angus bulls. Eric Davis and Colm Keller were on one of their regular stakeouts in front of the dilapidated Middle Homestead, one of the most notorious hotspots on the property. They were looking out over an open field towards some trees. Eric was scanning the distance with a pair of night vision goggles, while Colm was taking long exposure shots of the night sky. Suddenly, the dogs with them began to yelp and cower behind their legs. At the same time, Eric took a sharp breath and said, "Jesus, there's something in the trees over there." A huge black thing, not visible to Colm, seemed to be moving north. Colm continued taking shots while his teammate announced, "It's got me. It's saying we are watching." Eric, muttering "Jesus Christ" repeatedly, seemed to be experiencing inner turmoil. Finally, he said that the object was moving away. After the ordeal, Colm asked Eric what had happened, and he replied that he didn't know. On the way back to the observation trailer, Paul noted how jumpy his colleague seemed, wondering if he was more disturbed by his experience than he was letting on. Over the summer, the NID's team played cat and mouse with the infamous orbs of light, which appeared regularly all over the property, but always seemed one step ahead. In August, 2 team members had one of the most frightening experiences. Around 3:30 a.m., they were on top of the ridge looking down towards the notorious Middle Homestead. Only one of them had a pair of infrared binoculars, while the other looked after various scientific instruments and sensors. Standing on the ridge for about 3 hours, they were about to move on when Mike, the investigator with the binoculars, noticed a light appear in a pasture about 150 feet below. Bizarrely, his colleague Jim could only see a dull illumination, yet through the infrared goggles, it appeared as bright as the moon. It was hovering about 3 feet off the ground, and Mike was talking about how it seemed to be growing in size when he abruptly stopped and said, "It's not a light. It's a tunnel. I can see through to the other side." Jim asked if he could take a look, but Mike was transfixed on the strange phenomenon. "There's something in the tunnel," he exclaimed. He could see a huge black featureless figure crawling on its elbows and knees from the other side of the tunnel. He then witnessed it climb out of the tunnel and run up the side of the ridge, moving faster than was humanly possible. Both investigators heard the shale crunch under its feet as it ran past them, about 30 feet away, before disappearing into the darkness. Immediately afterward, they were greeted by a terrifyingly eerie silence, as an odd musky odor hung in the night air. In many ways, the things that the NID's team witnessed were as frightening, bizarre, and inexplicable as the activity the Sherman family had experienced. They saw the same orbs of light, metallic UFOs, strange creatures, portal-like anomalies, cattle mutilations, poltergeist-like activity, strange odors, magnetic fields, and heard underground noises, among other things. By mid-1998, the activity had started to decline, remaining that way for many years until the team finally pulled the plug and left the property in 2004. They had not succeeded in explaining what was occurring, but for the time being, they had succeeded in putting an end to the strange activity on the ranch, even if this was not the outcome they had hoped for. There is a common belief among skeptics that the NID's team failed to gather any supporting evidence. In some ways, this is true, but not entirely accurate. They did succeed in recording some of the anomalies on film. In fact, so did Terry Sherman when he owned the ranch. And some of this can be seen in Jeremy Corbell's documentary, Hunt for the Skinwalker, which is based on Colin Keller's and George Knapp's work of the same name. Most of this video evidence was rejected by the NID's advisory board, as the majority of the recordings took place at night and captured the most common phenomenon, orbs of light. Unfortunately, due to the darkness, these recordings only depicted what looked like indistinct points of light in the night sky or off in the distance, and were pretty mundane. The point then the NID's team made in the aftermath of their investigation was that whatever was haunting the ranch did not like the intrusion. It did not want to be investigated. It was always one step ahead and seemed to be completely in control. Equipment would inexplicably fail at the most inopportune times. The phenomena seemed to know when the team was waiting for something to happen. And when something did happen, it would occur just outside their camera's field of view and would be far too brief to record. In any case, the activity was nearly always one of a kind, and it rarely, if ever, repeated itself. This was extremely frustrating for those involved in the investigation, and Robert Bigelow himself would go on to describe the phenomena as a precognitive sentient intelligence. Despite all this, there are hundreds of well-documented eyewitness accounts not just from the NID's team, but also from neighbors, residents of the Uinta Basin, and people who have visited the ranch out of curiosity. Skinwalker Ranch is a rich tapestry of strange occurrences, far too bizarre and unbelievable for many people to accept. But if there is any truth to the claims, and if there are explanations out there, what could they be? First of all, let's address the elephant in the room. Could the whole thing have been an elaborate hoax? Were the Shermans faking the phenomena to offload a property that had turned out to be a financial disaster? They had lost a lot of cattle and were on the verge of bankruptcy after all. But why invent such fantastical stories? Surely this would only damage their reputation and ultimately devalue the land. Not only this, but UFOs and strange creatures had been seen and reported in the region for centuries, and neighbors of the Shermans reported similar activity on their ranches. This somewhat suggests that the phenomena was not unique to Skinwalker Ranch, and by extension, not the product of the Shermans' imaginations. They could not have invented hundreds of years' worth of experiences. Add in the fact that Robert Bigelow was convinced enough to purchase the property, as well as invest millions in a decade-long study, and that the phenomena was also witnessed by the investigative team, who, as it happens, were PhD professors and initially skeptical. Some skeptics have argued that the whole thing was created by George Knapp and Robert Bigelow in the hopes of turning the ranch into a supernatural tourist spot. But one, this hasn't happened. In fact, Bigelow held on to and protected the property for 20 years, and the only thing he changed in that time was the front gate. 2. Consider again the accounts of the locals, which stretched back for centuries. These experiences were there long before Bigelow, Knapp, or even the Shermans had anything to do with the ranch. So, if not a hoax, what else could have been occurring? Were visitors to the ranch suffering some sort of mass delusion? It is not impossible, but highly unlikely given the sheer number of people involved. As already mentioned, NIDs carried out a battery of tests to rule out any environmental factors, and they found no common thread in the psychological profiling of people they talked to and even themselves, which would point to mass delusion. Not only that, but in many cases, Physical evidence was left behind, be it footprints, mutilated cattle, vaporized dugs, and detectable magnetic fields, among many other things. These physical signs were not imagined. Perhaps the most popular theory among people who believe the phenomena to be real is that the ranch was the scene of extraterrestrial visitation. While it's true that many UFOs, strange craft, and creatures were seen, anything that was left behind by the phenomena, and later studied by the NIDS team, yielded only terrestrial signatures. This does not entirely rule out the involvement of extraterrestrials, but it certainly points in other directions. For instance, could there be any truth to Native American legends regarding skinwalkers? After all, the Utes firmly believed that the Navajo put a curse on their lands after the latter was pushed out of northeastern Utah. Many of the things witnessed on the ranch do seem to fit in with how Native Americans describe skinwalkers, but certainly not all of the phenomena can be attributed to these particular entities. Another widely considered possibility is that the military was somehow responsible for the strange occurrences. Terry Sherman certainly seemed to think so. It is indeed plausible that the military used the secluded ranch to test out advanced and secretive technologies, with the residents becoming unwitting guinea pigs in experiments involving psychological warfare. Interestingly, the NIDS Advisory Board contacted a number of remote viewers and asked them to examine the property. While controversial, remote viewing was studied by the CIA for over 30 years, and in many cases, the results of these studies were astounding. The first remote viewer had no information about the ranch or any knowledge of what had taken place there, yet he was able to produce an almost exact sketch of its layout, including the 3 homesteads, the creek, the canal, and the ridge. He pinpointed an area on the southwestern part of the property, stating that there was an energy field there, which he described as disturbing. Another remote viewer stated that the second homestead where some of the most disturbing phenomena took place was the site of weird energy vortices. The third remote viewer was asked to describe what happened during the daylight mutilation of the cow. He got the impression that it was carried out by a drone of interdimensional nature, and that it had some connection to the military. Another remote viewing exercise conducted by multiple people described the ranch as the site of a military operation. 3 of the 5 participants independently perceived an underground base and a large network of electronic equipment and wires that had been embedded in the ground. Others saw Navy personnel in dark sunglasses and sporting Navy tattoos, reporting that much of the activity was taking place outdoors and at night, and was somehow linked to an aircraft carrier. Another of the group perceived humanoid figures who spoke in a strange language and were seen to be working alongside human beings. While it's true that the military could have been involved, there are problems with this suggestion. What of the strange creatures that were seen or the orbs of light that could affect human emotions? What about the portal-like structures or the fact that the phenomena stretches back to a time before the U.S. military was even conceived? Unless there are other intelligences involved which have since invited collaboration with human beings and the military-industrial complex overall, it was said that all remote viewers came away from the task with feelings of dread, darkness, and death, and a notion. Whatever is taking place at the ranch is inherently evil. Others have described the property as an interdimensional gateway, where entities of all kinds have the ability to drop into our reality at will and leave just as quickly. Some have even suggested that maybe all paranormal and supernatural phenomena reported all over the world, from cryptids and aliens to poltergeists and UFOs, all come from the same place. We see fleeting glimpses of them when they choose to show themselves to us. But then there are certain epicenters where all of these phenomena leak through en masse, and maybe Skinwalker Ranch is just one of those hotspots. Whatever it is that haunts the property, it is clearly intelligent, but its agenda remains unclear. It was certainly able to differentiate between animals and humans, as no person who stepped foot on the ranch was ever harmed. On the other hand, countless cats, dogs, cattle, and even wildlife were mutilated indiscriminately. But it is no worse than what we have done to animals ourselves. The intelligence behind the activity did seem to enjoy tormenting the Shermans, and later than its investigators. At times, it seemed able to read people's minds and listen in on private conversations, such as when Gwen mentioned to Terry the possibility of losing the bulls. It acted on that information without hesitation, much like a trickster or prankster would do. At times, it seemed almost omnipotent. More than 20 years later, the Shermans have closed the book on their ordeal. They moved to Idaho and started a new life, accepting that they would probably never know what it was that destroyed their dreams so completely. Robert Bigelow held on to the ranch for many years afterwards. The activity was sporadic throughout the '90s, but never quite reached the peak experienced in the mid to late '90s. He sold the property to Adamantium Real Estate in 2016 on the condition that research would continue. Almost immediately after the sale went through, the activity experienced a huge spike. UFOs have since been photographed directly over the homestead. In Jeremy Corbell's documentary, Hunt for the Skinwalker, he happened to ask the new owner what he says to people who doubt the phenomenon is real. His answer was simple: "You're delusional." Whatever the case may be, only time will tell if there is any truth to the tales from Skinwalker Ranch.